Hello, welcome to this episode of Industry Voice. Today we have Joshua Hollander. How are you, sir?
I'm well, and Josh is fine. Thanks, Jeff.
Let's go with Josh. And coming to us from Josh's studio.
Yes,
And
thank you. I am in my office. Thanks.
Josh, you had me on your podcast a couple of years ago. And, when I launched this podcast, I was like, you know what? I'm creating a show called Industry Voice to highlight the influencers, the community builders, and the creators, the creator media. And gotta have you on. So here we are. We're
Thank you.
gonna we're gonna talk about you, your personal career, and your podcast, and maybe we'll go into some of your favorite podcast guests. And so yeah, so I'm turning the mic over to you, and I'm talk about you.
All right, great. Well, thanks. I appreciate you having me on. Saw you at ITC with your team there with the camera and everything else. So I see you've definitely jumped in with 2 feet. So that's awesome. And thanks for having been on my podcast as well, and the work you're doing in the space in general, both in terms of building businesses and then also on the creator side. Essentially the background for me is really doing things related to talent over the last decade or so. Horton International. Some people occasionally get confused because there's an insurance business, Horton, but it's an executive recruiting firm based in Connecticut. It was founded here in 1978. It's now headquartered out of the UK. We've got about 300 people worldwide. So we have folks, throughout Asia Pacific, Latin America, pretty heavily concentrated in Europe, and then a couple folks in the Mid East, and then our team here in the US as well that I lead. And so, it's executive recruiting, it's talent consulting, and so we will operate in multiple lines of business, but insurance, being in Hartford, uh, obviously a concentration of insurance businesses here, has always been kind of one of the industries that we've worked in. And then, from an InsurTech and insurance innovation perspective, we've been doing going back to about 2018 now, as well. For me personally, I spent a couple of decades in operating roles before getting into search. And so originally started my career in investment banking, worked in the M&A and corporate finance groups for Morgan Stanley in New York and San Francisco. Co-founded a fintech startup that, this goes back to the 90s, but nowadays it'd be called a robo-advisor. Back then, it was a white label hosted financial planning and advice platform. But, we were doing some pretty interesting things, had some pretty prominent investors like SoftBank Ventures and Warburg Pincus, had an insurer, Royal and Sun Alliance out of the UK as a strategic, clients like Prudential and E-Trade, joint venture in Japan with SoftBank, insurer AMP out of Australia, some folks may be familiar with, was a client. So we did some interesting stuff, a little bit ahead of the curve, to be honest, in the sort of mid 90s through early 2000s window until the business was sold. Long story short, I've had exposure to everything from, big global companies to startups and even sort of middle market, closely held businesses too. And, today, beyond the work and writing, I've had the podcast. I think I'm up to about 170 episodes on that now. I'd say it skews a bit more to highlighting some of the growth stage companies, even down to people who are pre-seed or, one or two people just trying to get something off the ground. But certainly some folks from more established incumbent organizations or consultants or VCs, PE guys, et cetera, et cetera. And then the sort of newest thing that I helped co-found, which we launched about a year and a half ago, I co-founded with Bob Sargent, who I'm sure a number of members of your audience would know, is the InsurTech Association. And so that is a not-for-profit, membership-based industry association, really trying to create community in the space, build resilience in the space, focus on, again, sort of that earlier stage group at the center, so Series A and earlier companies, and trying to help them with the networking and the expert content that can give them a greater chance of success in a complex, highly regulated industry that's got a lot of niches. And even if you have experience, let alone if maybe you're coming in from the outside. So, we've got almost 130 members, and we were just going over it yesterday. We have 129 member organizations. There's a few individuals in there, some angel investors, a couple of people who work in large org. And I want to say it's about 85 or 90 startups in that group. And then the rest, what we're trying to build is kind of a community of all the things the startups would need. So if you think about investment, if you think about capacity, if they're in that side of the equation, distribution, tech stack, professional services like I would offer, or say an attorney would offer, essentially, creating all those spokes around the hub of at the center. And so, that's kind of the phase we're into now. So generally speaking, we're doing a couple of online events a month and then doing in-person networking events, piggybacking off of some of the larger conferences like conference, InsurTech Insights, ITC, et cetera.
So I have your LinkedIn pulled up on the side,
Yeah,
and I'm going back to your background. Some of the things you did were interesting. Strategic advisor for Nassau Re, Imagine Incubator program,
yeah.
and Hartford InsurTech Hub mentor.
Yep.
Would you dive in a little bit into those two? And also for the audience, Josh's podcast is called InsurTech Leadership Podcast. So make sure you go to Apple Podcast, Spotify, and make sure you go subscribe. So let's go ahead and dive into your two interesting past stand.
Yeah, and I'll probably throw a third one into that a little bit too. It's not the same sort of structure, but I am on the board of an organization called Insure, which is focused on helping the industry develop more products associated with climate and the energy transition and building resilience and essentially new insurance products to support that transition. But yeah, so I mentioned that 2018 was kind of when we got more explicitly into InsurTech, as it was. I mean, obviously there were insurance technology companies before that, but when that sort of became more of a thing. So the Hartford InsurTech Hub operated for 3 years here in Hartford, and it was a accelerator program, not unlike some of the others that have developed since then, but basically it was being used by an economic development tool run by Startup Bootcamp, and some of the economic development players in the Hartford area, and looking to attract startups in, founders in, and their teams in, for an in-person accelerator program, with the goal of hopefully connecting them with some of the potential customers that they might have and other stakeholders they might have in the area, and see, first of all, if it could help them build viable businesses, but then also maybe consider planting a flag here in Connecticut and building out those organizations. So, yeah, given some of my kind of diverse business background and interest in the space, I could see kind of the same trends happening in insurance that had happened in other parts of financial services, essentially two decades earlier. And I wanted to get ahead of that curve and see if I could get involved as that developed, and leverage my experience having gone through that, to help some companies, and also, do search work in that space because I thought it'd be interesting. And then the Nassau program was something that, Paul Tyler kicked off. So he was, again, also trying to provide resources and physical space to companies that maybe were on the earlier stage side. And unfortunately, that was also kind of a physical space-driven model when he started, and the pandemic made both of those organizations or programs kind of tough to continue in that model. So Startup Bootcamp, kind of the last group, kind of was cut off early, right at the beginning of the pandemic. And then Paul shifted that to a kind of a remote model a little bit differently. Over time, I wasn't as involved, but early on there were a lot of roundtables. He brought a lot of experts in to try to help companies out, et cetera, in that model. And then the Insure one that I mentioned, Charlie Sidoti is the one who had the idea. Climate was just one area that he was thinking about when he first founded it, but over time, with the support of the executive committee and the board, decided to narrow in more and more on there. And there's a range of programs, from running an innovation challenge with the state of New York to looking at things around wildfire in California to trying to build a group of earlier stage career people who want to kind of have community grassroots efforts to address some of these issues in your local communities, and so continuing to, again, in different ways, build programs. Another one is around community embedded insurance, trying to find ways to, whether it's municipalities or other defined communities, come up with programs that can make sure the underserved are protected, and that rather than the excess cost of dealing with the damages after some sort of a catastrophe, potentially through some more investment on the front end, you're going to lower your cost base and again strengthen communities and give them more resilience and protection.
With all the things you've done, you have been around a lot of founders, from the nonprofit to being mentors, being on associations. You decide to do a podcast to interview and storytell founders who are in pre-C, Series A, founders who have idea and try to make their idea happen. If you have to summarize some of the traits for some of the most successful founders that you interviewed, what do you think those traits are? Thank you for all your support to our channel. Here is a quick word from our sponsor. Please click on the link below in the comment section to sign up for a demo with Track AI.
What if your insurance sales conversations could work harder for you? Meet Track, your AI-powered conversation intelligence partner. Track automatically captures and analyzes every customer interaction, providing instant call summaries, risk analysis, and AI-driven coaching insights. Say goodbye to manual note-taking and hello to more selling time. Track handles the admin work while you handle the revenue. Fully integrated with your favorite platforms. Plus, get custom AI analysis tailored to your unique business needs. Transform your sales team's performance with Track. Visit track.ai today.
Click the link in the description below to schedule a demo with Track today.
It's a lot of energy. I think it's clarity of message. I think it is a mental agility, so an ability to process feedback and then whether it's course correct or further lean into something that's working, be able to do that. I think it is an ability to create an environment where people feel comfortable. Well, first of all, understand their role, but secondly, feel comfortable taking responsibility for that role. Hopefully most of what they do is successful, but if certain things may not work as planned, it's okay to fail or okay to stumble a bit, and know that you're not going to be penalized for that or punished for that, and sort of have that flexibility to do that. Some of the folks, I think, culture is a big word. Sometimes it's overused. Sometimes I think it's underused, to be honest. But I think it is building a culture, and the culture can vary. It's not a one size fits all, but I think it's being clear about what that culture is, and then making sure to bring the talent in that fits that and is going to be comfortable within it. And then the last thing I would say is, and most important, is whether they explicitly consider themselves to be or claim they're not. I think the number one thing they are is ultimately they're salespeople. So whatever their message is, whether it's to potential customers, whether it's to potential investors, whether it's to potential people they want to recruit onto the team, they have an ability to listen, understand what's important to the person on the other side of the table, and be able to, craft a message that either is going to solve their pain or inspire them to want to move forward, and be able to sell them on wherever it is they want them to go.
When you are mentoring them, so you take that skill set that you had mentoring InsurTech founders, and then you now interviewing founders. Sometime in the back of your head, you got to be thinking like, oh man, this person have a blind spot they don't see. What do you think those blind spots are when you talk to founders who are like excited out of the gate, but they don't see their blind spot? Because at the end of the day, 90% plus will fail. That's just the mathematics statistics.
Yeah. Well, so one is a little bit more personal, given what I do from a recruiting point of view, which is, I think it can happen not just with founders, but I think it's more more pronounced with founders, which is sort of an assumption that their company is so great, and whether it's a product or a service, whatever they're building is so everyone should want to be a part of it. And I mentioned number one skill is selling. I think it's a humbleness and a recognition that the best talent has options, and as much as you may be qualifying them or trying to get them on board to your organization, they're doing that at least as stringently with you, and you really have to recognize that it's a mutual sales and qualification process there. So that's one thing. I would say that there was another one. Sorry, I just kind of drew a blank on a little bit. But in terms of a blind spot, I think that the whole fundraising process has changed pretty dramatically. I think we had a period where there were a lot of folks who were thinking about their businesses in terms of not how am I building this business, but more how am I getting to the next round of funding. I don't think there's the option to do that as much now. I think most investors are looking for companies that have a clear path to profitability, and or are already demonstrating profitability, and so that's changed a bit. And I think most founders have recognized that, but I think that's sort of more broadly the amount of time that it takes to raise capital, the amount of distraction associated with raising capital is a big one. The other one that I think specific to the insurance industry, and particularly folks who come from outside, just fully appreciating the complexity. So, you could have someone who's coming in from outside the US who's had success building something in another market. Maybe they somehow think the regulatory framework is going to be easier than what they've dealt with, and then they come to here to realize they got 50 regulators they have to deal with. You need to start with the problem someone else has, and figure out how you can solve for that, versus, hey, here's this cool technology, or here's this unique data set that we have that we can leverage. I'm sure there's something you can do with this, and trying to sell upward that way, I think is another big one I see sometimes when people get a little too enamored with what they've built versus really having an insider's knowledge of the industry and what the problems or pain points people have, and working back from there to show them how you can solve that.
That's a great point. Like people don't say enough. Like I have met some folks from Europe that were talking to me at ITC or InsurTech Insights events, and they tell me their idea, and I'm just listening to them. They're like, "Yeah, US is so behind. We're gonna do this thing this way. We're gonna bring this tool here, and you guys gonna all love it." And I'm just like,
Yeah, so and I will say, insurance has its unique challenges because of the regulatory framework, and just there's so many steps in the value chain and so many different players who can potentially be involved in that. And then obviously so many lines of business, it just makes this crazy matrix, right? That you have to figure out exactly where you're going to fit in, or who you need to get to in order to kind of move things forward. But I mean, we see it in other industries too, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's, B2B SaaS companies in general, where a business has success in a local market, somewhere else in the world. They've got a playbook and they come to the US and they think they can just use that same playbook here. And then they fail because they don't recognize how people buy differently here, and the some of the subtleties and communication that are required here. And a lot of times we end up doing sort of the second, general manager for the US or North America, or because they transferred someone over, or they thought they could just hire someone just to kind of be a face in the US, and they could handle everything on the back end from their local market, and they find out it just doesn't work that way.
I think another thing that people forget is the culture is different, Europe, Asia versus US. We have so many drive-throughs, right? We have drive-throughs. People expect instant gratification on service. And then another thing is we have a lot of call centers in the country because people want to talk to real human beings still.
Yeah.
There are other areas, maybe they don't, but in the US, every single place we talk to, we want to talk to customer service. We don't want to go through prompts. I think that's a culture thing that it will stay here for a while.
Yeah, I agree. And just to narrow in, finding people in the early days of a business that's trying to scale up here, who understand some of the cultural nuances of the market where the business is headquartered, how to work with a largely remote organization, even just dealing with the time zones, right? Like, do you want to have your one or two people in California when the business is headquartered in Germany, and now you got a 9-hour time difference that's going to reduce your window for collaboration versus, say, the East Coast? Yeah, it's even little stuff like that that sometimes can trip folks up. So, I agree totally. It's sometimes the big picture stuff is easy to figure out. It's the more nuanced where people stumble.
So change gear for a second. I want to talk about your podcast and some of your guests.
Yeah.
Is there any favorite top 2, top 3 guests that you had on your show and that just blew you away?
Yeah, I mean, going all the way back to the beginning, I thought, Phil Reynolds, who started Brightcore, I just thought he was super interesting because I thought he was very intentional about how he built the culture of that organization. He also, pre-pandemic, made a conscious decision to take his business fully remote. The intentionality with which he did that, the ground rules that he used for how decisions would be made, how to make sure that the right people were in the right room, so to speak, at the right time, for the different parts of the business or different levels of decision making and execution that were required. I thought was super interesting. So he's always stood out. He was one of my first guests. More recent guests that stands out is Valkyrie Holmes. So she's someone who's got a very unique background, earlier stage of career, but has already been involved with some different startups in different ways and different types of innovation in different ways, but has, jumped into the industry with 2 feet without a background in it, is working on, wildfire and some of these catastrophe issues and, getting traction and proving that an early stage, woman without a background in insurance can get a startup off the ground, which is almost like starting with 3 strikes against you if you understand a lot of, how the demographics of the industry is.
So true. She's impressive.
Yeah, she's a character. She's a cool person.
So, out of all the guests that you had, is there anybody that you said, wow, this thing they invented is a little bit too early?
Oh boy. I don't
Like
know.
there's a lot of company out there, right? Like they came out with something too early. And
Yeah, no,
for some
I mean,
reason I was just like thinking about this other
well,
day.
I mean, just to go back to my own story, I mean, I lived it, right? So we essentially came up with this concept. And as I mentioned, we had Prudential as a client, we had E-Trade as a client. We had, something that I don't know, if you're familiar with the Motley Fool, but we even had them where we created a product for their customers that I built out. Mellon Financial, who ultimately bought the business, another client. And so essentially what happened for us was like all these financial institutions saw where the industry was going, saw how they were going to need to leverage technology to kind of scale. But the reality was that, download speeds, user interfaces, and just the concept of holistic financial planning versus transactional financial product sales was still very early, and getting the second sale, getting the advisors and their clients to actually use the technology, mid 90s, early 2000s was tough. And so I've lived that experience. The concept is right, but the timing isn't quite there yet. I'm just, I've done like 170 episodes, so I'm trying to go through my mental Rolodex to think about if there's anything that maybe was too early off the top of my head. What I would say, I think there's finally some momentum in the space. Probably something related to life insurance and annuities, and either trying to expose a different audience to those products or a broader audience, or getting people to think about them earlier. I've seen some people start to get some traction maybe in niches, but you don't call anyone out individually necessarily. But I think that's a sector where I'm starting to see a little bit more movement. A couple years ago, there are probably a couple of guests I talked to, whether they were looking at, trying to engage people in the pre-retirement phase and get them to think about what some of the potential challenges they might have, whether they're looking at it from an estate planning perspective or an income generation perspective. And then there have been others who trying to get, again, as I mentioned, people who are younger to look at some of these products when they typically wouldn't. I would say that sector's maybe been a little bit early with some of the things people have tried to do.
So I really appreciate you coming on the podcast and we get to hear about Josh's story. I'm gonna give you a fun one to wrap this off. This year I was at ITC, right? And then you were there. The theme was overwhelming AI.
Yeah.
But a couple of years ago, it was blockchain, right?
Embedded.
Embedded. What do you see? Do you think blockchain will make a comeback in the insurance industry, InsurTech industry, in where its place is, especially with data on blockchains? Because it's so quiet, right? Like I haven't heard a founder talk about blockchain or crypto or stable coin on reinsurance or anything of those sort.
Well, I definitely think people will increasingly use smart contracts. I think that I've so we're sort of running the spectrum here, but I think people use smart contracts. I think people may do some interesting things that would allow trade insurance assets using the blockchain, and I think potentially allowing people to actually use crypto for insurance products and then facilitating that through the blockchain. I think people are working on all these things. So the answer is I 100% think that it is happening in the background, even if it doesn't have the sort of front page buzz that it had, and probably increasingly become. I don't know if it'd be when it would be standard business practice, but I think it'll increasingly be used.
Nice. Josh, thank you for coming on the show. And I have your intake form over to your inbox. And our audience will be able to connect with you, follow you on all of your shows. So please make sure you go check out the comment below. And it has a link about Josh and his company, his podcast. So make sure you go check him out. And thank you again for coming on the show.
Yeah, Jeff, it's been fun. Thanks for having me on. And yeah, people can check out my LinkedIn page, but Horton-USA.com is the website. InsurTech Leadership Podcast is the podcast. And we'd love to have more members at the InsurTech Association. The membership fees are, quite low, particularly for startups. And, we're building a real community, and we'd love to have more people involved. So please check that out at insurtechassociation.org.
Awesome.